If we assume we can only see what we comprehend, then is it possible to surmise that many of the art historical truths we have are transient? How we perceive art is reflected in our understanding of the period and culture in which it was conceived. As historical and social perspectives change, so do ours. In a series of letters composed around 1484, Leonardo da Vinci wrote to Devlet Bar-Kaybai on the findings of a lengthy scientific mission conducted along the Turkish coast in the aftermath of a natural disaster. In 2001, Michael White published a new biography of Da Vinci's life, claiming the aforementioned letters to be a singular work of fiction, written to a fictitious governor of Cairo. To White, it seemed impossible that 15th century artists moved freely between Christian and Muslim centres, and thus, Da Vinci was simply fantasizing from an Italian location. Despite this, Kaybai was in fact the cultivated and culturally ambitious Mamluk Sultan Da Vinci had described in his letters. This case offers an example of the potential impact of a problematic outlook that dismisses or perhaps overlooks the cultural mobility in Renaissance Italy. In this video, I'll be looking at the artwork of Venetian Renaissance artist Gentile Bellini, whose connection with the Ottoman Empire had a significant and profound impact on his work. Before we take a closer look at some key examples, I'd like to set the scene. Let me take you back to Renaissance Venice. Situated on the Adriatic Sea, Venice became the bazaar of Europe during the Italian Renaissance through its overseas trade with the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia. Venice relied heavily on the exchange of commodities with the East for survival and prosperity due to its marshy location. In 1533, a Venetian ambassador for the Sublime Porte noted that we cannot live without the Ottoman Empire. Imports such as silk from the Orient meant that by the 16th century, Venice had developed a lucrative luxury silk weaving industry by introducing highly decorated and richly threaded damasks and velvets of fabrics for his formal costume in 1500. Doge Leonardo Loredon made explicit the visible influence of Oriental silks and designs. This acted as an effective advertisement for Venice's international power and prestige. Furthermore, the number of Venetians who had direct contact with the cities such as Constantinople, Alexandria, and Damascus were considerable. Merchants could spend years at a time in the East due to Venice's economic dependence on trade. Many young Venetians were sent abroad in order to learn useful languages such as Arabic, Greek, or Turkish, and to gain direct commercial experience. Thus, owing to Venice's extensive trade links, Gentile Bellini found inspiration in the Ottoman Empire even before he had travelled there. This is evident in his oil painting The Virgin and Child Enthroned, painted around 1475. The painting depicts the Virgin Mary with Christ seated on a throne in the centre of the painting. The Virgin's mantle is rendered to resemble velvet woven onto a cloth of gold in an originally Ottoman pomegranate design. After being adopted by Italian weavers, the design became popular in Italian luxury fabrics market, to the extent that Doge Leonardo Loredon introduced highly decorated and richly threaded damask and velvet as fabrics for his formal costume. The oriental mat under the Virgin's feet is a Muslim prayer mat, recognizable due to the triangular niche which acted as a reference to the direction of Mecca, the most holy site in Islam. These prayer mats were popular in 15th century Italy. One is recorded to be in the possession of the Duke of Mantua in 1483. These prayer mats were often laid on tables or chests and not meant to be walked on. Thus, the placing of the rug below the Virgin's feet implicitly lifts her above the level of everyday life. The inclusion of Eastern objects required an audience that would appreciate its value and recognize it as Eastern, thus emphasizing the idea that the exchange of these Islamic objects was commonplace in Venice. With its colored marble and porphyry, the backdrop of the throne, derived from the architecture of ancient Rome and Byzantium, emphasizes the link between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, the design of the throne is thought to have been inspired by a stone seat in the church of San Pietro de Castello in Venice, which had originally been an Islamic funerary monument from Antioch in Asia Minor. Therefore, it can be argued that Gentile's presumably knowing inclusion of his design acts as another example of the relationship between Venice and the Eastern Mediterranean. It could be suggested that the Ottoman Empire had a direct influence on Bellini's work due to the influx of pigments from the East that expanded the artist's colour palette. Pigments such as lapis lazuli, vermilion, and cinnabar provided Renaissance paintings with their characteristic brilliant blues and reds, as seen, for example, in Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. There is no accessible record which lists every pigment Bellini used in the Virgin and Child enthroned. However, the bright blues in the sky and vivid reds for the Virgin's mantle are likely to indicate that they were the materials used. Thus, by examining subject matter and materials in the Virgin and Child enthroned, one can conclude that Gentile Bellini was to a great extent inspired by the East for this work. In 1479, Venice dispatched one of her best-known artists, Gentile Bellini, to Constantinople as a diplomatic favour. This followed Giovanni Dario's visit to Mehmed II's court in Constantinople to negotiate a peace settlement following the Sultan's sacking of the city. Giorgio Vasari wrote that Gentile had been in Constantinople no long time when he portrayed the Emperor Mehmed from life so well that it was held a miracle. This oil painting is named Portrait of Mehmed II and painted in the year 1480. His painting is widely considered an important participant in a resulting transition away from stereotypes towards more authentic images of the Islamic figure. This is largely due to the painting not being able to sit comfortably in the conventionally colonial category of West representing East. The influence from the Ottoman Empire is clearly seen. The Islamic sitter is dressed in traditional Ottoman clothing. However, it was no coincidence that Mehmed II asked a European artist to paint his portrait. The painting style of his portrait is strongly in the European tradition, as seen by the individuality given to Mehmed, as well as the use of pictorial depth to render the subject as three-dimensional. It is possible to assume that Mehmed II was impressed by such skilled artistry when he asked for a suitable painter as part of the settlement. Bellini fulfills Mehmed II's request of the services of a European artist with the distinctive skills about artistic culture by making references to religious European paintings. For example, the decorated pillars that frame Mehmed resembled the door jambs patterning in the Annunciation with St. Amadeus by Crivelli, as well as the doorway of the Venetian church of San Zaccaria. In the foreground of the painting, the jewelled cloth mirrors the designs used for the hem of the Virgin's gown, encampings the Virgin and Child before a fire screen. To elevate the sitter's status, Gentile painted 3 golden crowns in the top third of the painting, representing Greece, Trebizond, and Asia, which Mehmed ruled, redefining borders and territories, and thus highlighting an exposure to cultures beyond his own. As well as this, the partially legible inscription at the bottom left corner reads Imperator Orbis, meaning ruler of the world. One can also draw a comparison between this painting and the classical tradition of portraits in profile, most typically seen on ancient coins depicting ancient emperors or an Olympian god or goddess. During his 16 months in Constantinople, Gentile Bellini was commissioned to make a bronze medal of Mehmed II that resembled ancient Greek and Roman coins. It could be suggested that Mehmed II's choice to be rendered in this classical tradition was a way to align him with ancient Roman emperors and gods, thus highlighting his great wealth and power. Known as the Conqueror, Mehmed II was seen as a great military leader. After his conquest of Constantinople at the age of 21, Mehmed claimed himself to be the Caesar of the Roman Empire, as Constantinople had previously been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. This reference to Caesar shows Mehmed II's knowledge of the ancient Roman emperors and his desire to be placed among them. An interesting aspect of this painting is the mutual conversation that was required to construct the work. Although painted in a European painting style, this was at the behest of Mehmed II, and thus acts to reflect a two-way exchange of ideas between the East and West, artist and sitter. Perhaps rather than highlighting the Ottoman Empire's influence on Bellini, this painting embodies a wider mutual cultural exchange between Venice and Constantinople. The artist's experience in the East had a clear and profound impact on Gentile's later work upon his return to Venice, as shown by his inclusion of Oriental figures in St. Mark preaching in Alexandria, 1504. The painting shows St. Mark, the patron saint of Venice, preaching to a group of Egyptian Mamluks, North African Moors, Turks, Persians, Ethiopians, and Tatars. Broughton describes Bellini as at pains to depict the intermingling of communities and cultures in a scene that evokes both the Western Church and the Eastern Bazaar. Bellini's authentic rendering of costume within this painting can be credited to drawings brought back by the artist from Constantinople, and thus it is clear that the Ottoman Empire had a profound impact on the artist's work. Furthermore, not only was Bellini inspired by his trip to the East, it seems he was proud of it too. In addition to a knighthood, Gentile was gifted a Turkish chain equal in weight to 250 gold coins by Mehmed II. In St. Mark preaching in Alexandria, at the foot of St. Mark's pulpit is an unmistakable self-portrait of Bellini wearing the chain gifted to him by Mehmed. Through this inclusion of such an object, it is clear that Mehmed's patronage is evidently not a source of embarrassment, but a mark of distinction. Prior to Bellini's time in Constantinople, it could be argued that the Ottoman Empire had a minimal influence on his art, as his exposure was limited to Eastern artifacts exchanged in Venice. Despite this, Madonna and Child Enthroned highlights an early interest in the East and an acknowledgement of the prestige of Oriental objects accessed by Venetian trade with the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia. The artwork produced whilst in Constantinople and after clearly displays the Ottoman Empire's significant influence on Bellini's work, evidenced by his accurate depictions of Islamic figures and objects, drawing on his first-hand experience. By examining these three distinct time periods, it is apparent that the Ottoman Empire had an increasing and significant influence on Gentile Bellini's artwork. Furthermore, Bellini's work highlights the difference between Orientalism during the Renaissance and the later movement during the Romantic period. The works of Gentile and Dürer have often been referred to as 15th century Venetian Orientalism, which alludes to Edward Said's groundbreaking 1978 study Orientalism. Despite this, in the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was not seen as the degenerate weak power of a later Orientalist cliché, but rather as a menacing military power, ever present mentally and frequently literally. Renaissance Turk is invincible and respected, as opposed to the Romantic Turk, who is innocuous and lesser. Therefore, by looking at the works of artists like Bellini with his accurate rendering of Islamic figures and objects, it is evident that the boundaries between the East and West were thoroughly permeable, meaning cultural histories previously concrete are now ripe to be rewritten. With an increasing acceptance that societies were more heterogeneous in the past than previously thought, our understanding of the multiple influences on art will change. At a time of increased xenophobia and nationalism, art can play an important global role in uncovering new cultural connections and perspectives from the past. It has never been more important to find the commonality and stories that bind us all.